Well, thank you, Mrs. Prince. It is truly an honor to be introduced by you. Mrs. Prince was always on everybody's list of favorite teachers, and I have vivid memories of a lot of the assignments and projects that we did with her. A lot of which were brought back just walking through those hallways this afternoon. I remember the pointillism project. I have to say the quality seems to have gone up quite a bit since I was here, which doesn't surprise me. But it's so amazing to be back. It's such a strange and beautiful thing. I feel like I'm sort of like I'm living like on two parallel like time planes, where it's 2018 and 1992 at the same time. But as Ms. Prince said, I am currently the executive producer of Shakespeare Festival St. Louis, which means that I have a pretty weird job, because mainly what I do is try to convince people that these bunch of plays that some guy wrote 400 years ago in another country will make their lives better. And, it's a sort of bold and funny claim, because on the one hand, Shakespeare is obviously this icon and this name that we recognize and sort of acknowledge as important. But on the other hand, these are just plays that we're talking about here. And they're full of funny language and weird words and jokes we don't get, and a lot of it can seem, frankly, over the top. But So how did I come to to dedicate my life to this idea that everyone, literally everyone, I think, would be served well by spending their time and money getting to know these plays. And I can say that it was something that I never imagined when I was here at Sycamore. It wasn't something that I even was aware of as a possibility, but it is the seeds of that journey were started here. And there's a lot of I can draw a straight line from some of the moments and experiences that I had in these walls. Maybe not these walls, because I don't think these walls are here yet. But those walls over there to where I am now, and everywhere in between. So I just want to talk about three things. Number one is how I came to Shakespeare. Number two is what I found in Shakespeare. And the last thing is why any of it matters. So how I came to Shakespeare, what I found, and why it matters. So how did I come to Shakespeare? First of all, I came to Shakespeare very late. I don't remember. Maybe some of my classmates remember. I don't really remember studying Shakespeare while we were here. Does anyone? No. Well, I've heard that they've rectified that, and the students now are forced to read Romeo and Juliet, and that they love it. So I'm glad that's happening. But I don't remember having it at Sycamore. I remember reading, Macbeth and Julius Caesar at North Central, and I got assigned a few of scenes from his plays in college, but I don't think, to be honest, that I read the full plays. So, I made it into adulthood thinking, like a lot of people, that Shakespeare felt a little bit stodgy and stale and frankly, boring. But at that same time, into my 20s, I knew I was 100% on the road to a life in the theater. And that story definitely starts at Sycamore. It started in third grade with Mrs. Mateson, who somehow convinced Mr. Ibe that a really good use of our class time would be to rehearse a musical. And she chose You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. And I don't remember auditioning for this play. We were selected. So I remember that. I remember being cast. I remember finding out what you were. And I was selected to be Pigpen. Now, Pigpen, as you might know, basically has one quality. He's filthy. That's all there is about Pigpen. So needless to say, I was not thrilled about this role. I felt underutilized. But that's when fate intervened. Because in a choice that she later had the wisdom to regret, Mrs. Mateson had given the plum part of Snoopy to John Comerford. Now, I like John Comerford. John Comerford was a very good friend of mine, but John Comerford was no Snoopy. And what's more, he was really having trouble learning his lines. So that's when Mrs. Mason showed herself to be a true impresario. Because in the middle of rehearsals, she relegated poor John Comerford to the grimy part of Pigpen and elevated the 8-year-old Tom Ridgely to the world's most famous beagle. I remember it as a triumph. And yet somehow, my career didn't immediately take off after that point. It languished altogether for another 3 years until, oddly, we had Mrs. Mason again in 6th grade, and she again managed to convince the powers that were that it would be good to devote some class time to a musical. This time, I think she really made the case that the content was historical. It would be tied to the curriculum. This was some integrated learning that was going on here, and so she chose Camelot, and this time there would be no miscasting. There was only one 11-year-old dashing enough to play Sir Lancelot. And so it fell to me. Despite of, or maybe because of the white turtleneck and tights that I had to wear to denote my purity, I felt that it was another, coup de théâtre. But that was it, again, until I went to high school. And I went to high school, I went to North Central for high school, and that, as I've said, it wasn't the easiest transition, or I didn't do the best with it. It was a big public school, but more than that, there were all these, most of the kids that went there went to, I don't know, wherever, like Northview or some of these other, what's the other one, East something? Eastwood, yeah, millions of these kids that had known each other forever and all, had all these great memories. But it was just Brooke and I at North Central. And so my freshman year was a little rough, or at least the first part of it was. But by the end, into spring semester, I'd made a couple friends, and a couple of them suggested, well, let's all go see the spring musical, which was Guys and Dolls. And looking back on it, I was like, that was like the great pivot point in my life, this moment, because I went and I saw it, and I'd never seen it or even heard of it before, but the songs were so catchy and the characters were so vivid, that by the time at the end of Sit Down, You're Rocking the Boat, when Nicely Johnson was standing on a desk and just wailing away, I was just in heaven. I loved it as theater, but it took me back to this place that I had at Sycamore of just being a part of something exciting and being a part of a group. And having a community like that, and so I wanted that feeling again. So then and there, I made my friends who I went with promise to force me, no matter how terrifying. I'm back. Thank you. That was it. So and that became sort of my world at North Central. I joined the show choir, and there was a class that you could take, a theater class, and I did really as many plays as I could, but I was still a far cry from being a Shakespearean, and so when I went to Indiana for undergrad, I kind of wavered a little bit on majors, but eventually ended up on theater and Spanish. Mrs. Knoll, thank you. You're here. There you are. There you are. Thanks to you. And then I moved to New York with a friend of mine that I met in college, and we started our own company, as Ms. Prince said. And as she also said, I started out as an actor, but I quickly moved to directing. I was an okay actor despite my Snoopy and Lancelot, but I could tell there were people that were better than me, and I really liked thinking about the big picture. So I became a director, and I really fancied myself a very avant-garde artist at that stage. So Shakespeare was still something that I felt was a little bit, stuffy. But after a few years, I got an opportunity to assistant direct a Shakespeare play at one of the big New York theaters. And I didn't know the director very well at that point, and I didn't know the play at all, but I loved this theater and would have done anything there. And so I said yes. And the play was Timon of Athens. Has anybody seen or read a production of Timon of Athens? Nobody. Mrs. Prince, maybe. Yeah, great. She's the only one. Nobody's seen this play. It is like the perennial frontrunner for most obscure Shakespeare play. Usually it's lumped in with a few other plays that they call problem plays, which is often kind of code for the bad plays. So it wasn't the most auspicious Shakespeare play to have an introduction to, but this guy, the director, was a fellow by the name of Barry Edelstein, and he is one of America's foremost Shakespeareans, and that really made all the difference. And so that experience really became kind of the second pivot in my life, because he was just so knowledgeable and so passionate, and when he would speak about the Shakespeare's language and his stagecraft, when he would do the practical work with actors, really masterful actors, to bring it to life, to make it clear and thrilling and exciting for an audience. I mean, it was just one of those moments where, I don't know what it was, but everything in my life sort of like clicked into place. Like someone was telling me, who was it? Was it Mrs. Burney? Are you here? Who has the nerd in disguise? Yes, yeah, it was one of her boys who called himself a nerd in disguise, I guess, when he was in high school. I think that's what I felt with. Something about the I don't know, the patterning or the forms and the conventions in Shakespeare became like this puzzle that was, for me, really thrilling to try and solve. It was hard and it was challenging, but then when you figured it out, it was like finishing a crossword. It was like, whew, look at that. Look what I just did. And I also was amazed because, at that point I had read and seen a number of Shakespeare plays, so I was so familiar with them. But this Timon of Athens is a very strange, weird play. It's very different. And so I found myself amazed that this guy who'd written Romeo and Juliet and Midsummer Night's Dream and Othello, what have you, had also written this really dark, satirical play. And so as an artist, I became very, very curious in who he was. And I remember a particular moment in that rehearsal process where we got to this play this soliloquy that's towards the end of that play. And I remember Barry called it, he said, this is one of Shakespeare's top 10. One of Shakespeare's top 10 soliloquies. And he was right, which is, for me, is always crazy to think about. There's this obscure play, Timon of Athens, right? And smack in the middle of it is this speech that is every bit as beautiful and amazing as To Be or Not to Be, or Friends, Romans, Countrymen, or All the World's a Stage, these much more familiar ones. So I knew that if something that good could be in a play like that, what could you imagine would be in some of the other ones? So I wanted to find out. And from then on, I really tried to, any opportunity I would get to see or read or hear a Shakespeare play, I really leapt at it. And what I found as I learned more and more and read more and more was just, I don't know how to describe it, but it's something like this, just a real nourishing richness to these characters and their stories, because getting to know them, getting to spend time with them, and seeing things through their eyes and sort of walking in their shoes, I found really just sort of expanding personally, on an intellectual level, on a emotional level, on a philosophical level, and it was just great fun. I loved it. And so that's a little bit of how I came to Shakespeare and what I found there. So what does it matter, right? Like, what's the big deal? You hear about this Shakespeare guy, and besides a few people like me that happen to get hooked on him, what is he? And there's a line at the end of Hamlet where Hamlet says to Horatio, his best friend, he says, but I'm very sorry, good Horatio, that to Laertes I forgot myself. For by the image of my cause, I see the portraiture of his. I'll say that last part again. By the image of my cause, I see the portraiture of his. And in describing that simple act of looking at someone else and seeing yourself in them, he managed, I think, to sum up his entire art. Because at the core of his work is this beautiful idea that when an individual's full humanity is revealed to us, that we cannot help but to care about them. And that was his unique gift, to be able to look at anyone who came into his view, kings and beggars, lovers, fighters, fools and sages. It didn't matter who, but he could look at them and see the fullness of their humanity, their virtues, their flaws, everything. And he could reveal it to us. So when we go to see his plays, we can't help but care. We care about Juliet. We care about what happens to Hamlet and to Shylock and to Othello. And they don't even exist. They're just figments of our imagination. But that act of caring about someone else, even for just a couple of hours, and seeing the fullness of their humanity, makes it, I think, that much easier for us to go out and do it every day with the very real people that we see in our workplaces, in our schools, and in our communities. And the better that we can be at doing that as a society, then the better we're making the world and everyone in it. So thanks for having me back. It's been a real thrill to be here.